Hi class, and welcome to chapter 2, Thinking Like an Economist. There are two schools of thought in economics: micro, which is a study of how households and firms make decisions and how they interact with the market. Micro being small, so we're talking about households and firms. We're talking about small groups of economics. Macro, the study of the economy as a whole. We're looking at the phenomenons. We're looking at things like inflation, unemployment, and economic growth. And this is where we're going to focus most of our time this semester, is on the macro. Now, an economy as a whole can be very, very large, like the United States economy, or can be small, like a small country. States do have macro issues, of course, because states do calculate their own unemployment and economic growth statistics. So they do look at macro, but they also do look at micro because we may be looking at an individual firm. In economics, we have two types of statements. We have the positive and the normative statement. Positive statements in economics attempt to describe the world as it is. They're descriptive. They can be confirmed or refuted by examining evidence. We like to think of these a lot of times, or I do especially, as data-driven. Normative statements are an attempt to basically describe how the world should be. They're prescriptive. They basically are kind of writing a prescription for the world. They're saying this is the way we'd like it to be, not the way it is. Economists play two roles in the United States and in the world today. They play the role of a scientist because they're always trying to explain the world and what's happening. And they also play a role as political advisors. They try to improve the world by using what they find out about the world to help policymakers understand the economic impacts of their decisions. So where in Washington do you see these policy advisors? Well, you see them obviously in the Council of Economic Advisors. That's the reason why they're called the Council of Economic Advisors. They're also in the Office of Budget and Management, or Management and Budget. They're in the Department of Treasury. They're in the Department of Labor. They're in the Department of Justice. They're in the Congressional Budget Office. And then they, of course, are in the Federal Reserve. So back to the statements. So as you imagine, these economists that are in Washington may be using both kinds of statements. They may be using these positive, descriptive statements, attempting to describe the world as is. Like, for instance, minimum wage laws cause unemployment. They can go out and they can find statistics and data that would basically, whether we believe or want to believe the statistic or not, that show that this statistically is true. Normative statements are much more prescriptive. They attempt to show what the world should do. So the government should raise the minimum wage. Now notice the word should in there. Should does not mean that we have any way of proving what would happen with that. If this was a positive statement, it would say the government in raising the minimum wage would cause unemployment. That would be a positive statement. So let's try a few. Okay, I'm going to go through these statements, and you guys are going to decide whether they're positive or they're normative. And can you tell the difference? Prices rise when the government increases the quality of money. The government should print less money. A tax cut is needed to stimulate the economy. An increase in the price of burritos will cause an increase in consumer demand for music downloads. All right, I'm going to start guessing which way they go. All right, the first one. Prices rise when the government increases the quantity of money. That's a positive statement. We can use data to show that this is a true statement or is not a true statement. We can confirm or refute the statement. The government should print less money. Notice the word should. Fortunately for that one, it's a normative statement, right? Because, well, fortunately, it is a normative statement. You cannot necessarily, there is no data to confirm that. You could make it a positive statement by saying that by printing less money, the government will stabilize the economy and GDP, and then we could prove that. This is a value judgment, though, this particular statement. It can't be confirmed or refuted, but it is a value judgment. Political candidates use a lot of these, don't they? We should do this, we should do this, we should do this. A tax cut is needed to stimulate the economy. This is a normative statement. It is a judgment call. Unless you can go out and prove that the tax cut will stimulate the economy, which, by the way, is very difficult to do, we'd have to be much more specific to get this to be a positive statement. We would need to be able to say a tax cut in this sector will do this, 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 and this. An increase in the price of burritos will cause an increase in consumer demand for music downloads. Believe it or not, this is a positive statement. Why? Because it describes a relationship. Burrito prices, consumer demand for music downloads. We can measure those relationships. We can look at the price of burritos in the market. We can look at how many music downloads. We can put a correlation between the two. It may not be true, but it is a positive statement that we can measure. Hopefully this helped a little bit on those two kinds of statements. Economists are very much scientists in a lot of ways, and we employ scientific methods to basically test theories of how the world works. We also use them to make assumptions about a very, very complex world and make them easier. For instance, when we study international trade, especially in microeconomics and principles, we'll only be using 2 countries and 2 goods. Now, that's not necessarily the entire model of trade within the world, but by taking 2 major goods and 2 major countries that trade in these goods, you can start to understand trade very, very clearly, which is a very complex issue, but can be clearly looked at by just simplifying a tad. So economists tend to use these types of models to simplify the relationship between things that may be fairly complex in reality, but the overriding issues can be seen by looking at them with these very simplistic models. We're going to look at 2 models today. The first model we're going to look at is the circular flow model. This is a visual model of the economy. It shows how dollars flow through the market among households and firms. This model has 2 decision makers, firms and households, and 2 interacting markets, the market for goods and services and the markets for factors of production, inputs, things that go into creating things. I'll show you how this works. So, if you imagine the 2 decision makers, the households, they own the factors of production. Why do they own them? Because in the economy, especially in our economy, the factors of production such as labor, households own, land, households own, forests, somebody has to own them, right? They either sell or rent them to firms for income. Now, the households are also involved in the opposite side. They are buying, consuming goods and services. Firms, on the other hand, are buying or hiring those factors of production, right? They're either buying those trees or buying that land that had those trees on it, or buying the land to put their factory on. And they're also buying labor. When you pay a wage, you are actually buying labor. And they're using those to produce goods and services. And then they're selling those goods and services back to the households. This comes out to be this. So remember, we had the firms on one side and the households on the other. The top and the bottom are the 2 markets. One is the markets for goods and services. So these are the things that are finished goods. And the others is the market for factors of production. So if we follow this around in a green method, you'll start to see what happens. So for instance, if you start off with the household spends money, follow the green, to buy what? Goods and services. In that market, those goods and services that the household buys become revenue for the firms. The firms then take that revenue and do what? They have to pay wages, they have to rent, or they own things, they use it for profit. That's the green line in there. But by having to pay rent and wages, etc., what are they doing? That's going into the market for the factors of production. That in turn becomes what? Income to the households. So if they're renting land, or they're buying timber from land that a household owns, what are they doing? They're going to have to pay in income to those households. This also, of course, includes the stock market, right? Because when we invest into a company, we are what? We are basically providing income into that company in terms of the purchase of stocks. That becomes factors of production. That becomes income into the households. The income then gets spent by the household, etc. It becomes revenue, goes around and around. So that's where the money's coming from. At the same point in time, the households have land, labor, and capital. That's going into the factors of production. That market, right? They are factors of production. That basically then goes to the firms who use them as inputs into their production of goods and services. Those goods and services are sold. We buy them as households and we go around in circles. So what happens when something shrinks? And here's where we start to look at the fact that the economy is all interactive. So the circular flow diagram, although you're probably saying to yourself, it's fine, it's really a great way of describing how an economy shrinks and grows. For instance, if you take a look at the very right-hand corner, that income, that green line that's going up, if income in the entire United States starts to shrink, then that green line is going to shift where? Inward, right? Well, if that green line shifts inward, then what happens to spending? Spending shifts inward. Well, if spending shifts inward, then revenue shifts inward. If revenue shifts inward, then wages and profits and rents shift inward, and then etc. And you keep shrinking the economy. So this is how recessions occur. Because as income shrinks and households are spending less, especially in a consumer market like the United States, that green line shrinking inward. And it doesn't matter which one happens first. If the income happens first or the wages happen first, doesn't matter. As that starts to shrink inward, it shrinks the entire economy, and vice versa. As income, wages, profits, etc., and revenue go outward, or companies start to make more money, the economy starts to expand. So you can start to see how everybody's interactively working together as an economy. So when people start to point fingers, oh, it's the household's fault, it's the firm's fault, it's obviously, it must be the market for goods and services, it must be the factors of production. You can start to see that every single one is interactive on the other, and they all have to work together to have the economy work. The other model that we're looking at is the production possibilities frontier, PPF for short. And this is a graph that looks at the combinations of outputs that the economy can possibly produce. And it's basically looking at production and technology. As I mentioned, we're simplifying this. In this particular case, this entire economy can only produce computers and wheat. They have one resource, labor, and it's measured in hours. The economy in total has only 50,000 hours of labor per month available for production. So then you can start playing around with this and you can say, okay, we know we can only make computers and wheat. So if we dedicate our employment hours totally to computers, all 50,000 of them, and we do no wheat, and we know that it takes 100 hours of labor to make one computer, and it takes 10 hours of labor to make 1 ton of wheat, we can then say to ourselves, okay, if we dedicate everything to computers, and we know it takes 100 hours to make a computer, then we know that 50,000 divided by 100 gives us 500 computers. So we're going to end up with 500 computers as an economy. That's going to be point A. Point B, we say, okay, we want computers, so we're going to go with 40,000 computers, but we're going to have a little wheat. We'd like to eat something. So now all of a sudden you take that 40,000 times the 100, because that's how much labor hours it takes to produce one computer. We get 400 computers, and then you take the 10,000 labor hours that we dedicated to wheat, we divide it by 10 hours, and we're going to get 1,000 tons of wheat. We do the same thing where we do half and half, which is 25-25. So we get 250 computers and 2,500 wheat. We do 10 and 40. We're going to flip it around. We get 100 and 4,000, and then we just go totally wheat, and we get 5,000. Remember how I said that all economies are adjusting and deciding how to allocate their resources, which are scarce for the present and the future. The production possibility is looking at the resource, right? A resource is scarce, labor. They only have so much of it, and they're allocating it across two different production. In this economy, they're trying to decide where they're going to produce and what they're going to produce. This then becomes this graph. So you can start to plot across the graph all the points. So we know now that point A on this graph means that we have 500 computers and 0 wheat. So that becomes point A. You can draw that on your graph. Point B becomes 400 and 1,000. Point C becomes 250, remember from the previous, and 2,500. Point D becomes 100 and 400. And point E becomes 0 and 5,000. This becomes your production possibilities frontier. And obviously there are all sorts of combinations in between. Like you could say to yourself, okay, what if we did 3,000 wheat? Then we could draw the line for 3,000, and what would we be at? 100 and something? So you can start to play around with it. On your graph, now that you've drawn, find the point that represents 100 computers and 3,000 tons of wheat and label it F. Do you think that that's possible for this economy to produce that combination? And why? Or why not? Well, what did you guys come up with? Did you come up with a point that looks something like this? Well, that point, although clearly viable, if you calculate it out, that would basically be 40,000 hours of labor. It's definitely possible, but you have 50,000. Why would you not use all the resources that you have available to you as an economy? It's possible, but it's not efficient, because to be efficient, you want to use what you have available to you. All right, now find a point that's 300 computers and 3,500 tons of wheat and label it G. Do you guys think that one's possible? Did anybody come up with this point? Slightly off the graph on the other side? Well, this actually requires 65,000 hours of labor. Not possible, because how many hours did you have? 50. You don't have that many. The economy can't go over the amount of labor they have. This particular point is not possible. It is off the production possibilities curve, and it is not possible. So points like A, B, C, D, E are efficient. They're utilizing all the resources, which in this case is labor. Points like F are possible, but they're not efficient. Some resources are being underutilized. That means that you're going to have unemployed workers, you're going to have factories idle. And points like G are just not possible. So as you move along that production possibilities curve that we just looked at, you're shifting resources from wheat to computers, or computers to wheat. And this is really looking at that trade-off that we talked about in chapter 1. To get more of one good means that you have to sacrifice another good. Now, remember what the trade-off was called? It was called the opportunity cost. The opportunity of cost of one good is in terms of the other good. So as you move towards more wheat, you are what? You have an opportunity cost of computers, and vice versa. How do you calculate this opportunity cost? The way you calculate this opportunity cost is by using the slope. Now, the slope is calculated by the rise over the run. So in this particular case, if you look at 2 points and you look at point A and point B, you can see that if you go from point A to point B, your rise is going to be 1,000, because you're going to go from 4 to 5,000. And it's going to actually be negative because you started at 5 and you go to 4. Sorry about that. Now, you're also going to go from 0 to 100. So that is actually a positive 100. So your slope in this particular case is negative 10. So for every computer, your opportunity cost is 10 tons of wheat. Now that's only if the line is linear. How do you remember this? Well, one of the things I always try to remember when I'm doing this is rise over run is basically what? It is literally like a treadmill. So any of you who've ever used a treadmill, the rise is what? The adjustment that you make up and down on your treadmill, in this case, 10 inches. The run is the distance that the treadmill is giving you to run on. In this particular case, it's 48 inches. So rise over run at this particular slope treadmill is 5 over 24. That is the what? The slope of the treadmill. There is a nice little recording here by the Federal Reserve. Ooh, sorry. And I'm going to pull this up for us now so we can watch it. And this is going to give us a little idea of how, in real life, this is used on a regular basis.
In the previous segment, we learned that scarcity forces people to make a choice. And when people choose, there is an opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative when a decision is made. It's what is given up. The opportunity cost of producing one more widget is the lost opportunity to produce 2 gadgets. So the PPF can be used to illustrate 2 very important economic concepts, scarcity and opportunity cost. Now let's move beyond the basics and see how the PPF graph illustrates some bigger economic ideas. The space right here on the inside of the frontier helps illustrate our next lesson. Lesson 3, a point inside the frontier represents underemployment. Movement back toward the frontier reflects economic expansion. The frontier represents maximum production with the available resources, but it isn't just the points along the line that are production possibilities. Econ Isle could alternately produce at any point inside the frontier. So while it could produce 4 gadgets and 4 widgets, it might produce only 2 gadgets and 2 widgets. In this case, Econ Isle would not be fully employed, or put differently, resources in Econ Isle would be underemployed. In fact, any point inside the frontier represents underemployment, which is a failure to reach full employment. Why would an economy produce below its potential? Well, it could be in a recession, which is a significant decline in general economic activity extending over a period of time. During a recession, Econ Isle's production will likely decline, resulting in workers losing jobs and leaving other resources, machines and factories, underutilized as well. When economic activity picks up again, production levels would likely move back towards the frontier. That is, the economy would move back toward full employment. The shift from recession toward the frontier is sometimes called economic expansion. So far, we've talked about Econ Isle's possibilities up to its frontier, but the frontier line itself can shift. 2 primary changes can cause the frontier to shift: a change in productive resources and technological change. Remember that the frontier reflects the available resources. The frontier will shift as the economy acquires or loses productive resources. For example, if the labor force grows and other resource levels stay the same, the frontier will shift outward. Or if an economy diverts resources to produce more capital goods, which means they are using economic resources to make other resources, the frontier will shift outward. Technological change is an advance in overall knowledge in a specific area. The gains achieved through technological change tend to be gains through increased productivity, or an increase in economic output per input. In fact, productivity is measured as the ratio of output per worker per unit of time. Take Fred, for example. Imagine Fred can produce 2 widgets per hour, but then his productivity improves and he can produce 3 widgets per hour. Notice that there is still only 1 Fred, and we are still measuring his production per hour, but his output has increased. 2 factors can increase worker productivity over time: investment in physical capital, things such as computer software and tools, and human capital. Human capital is the knowledge and skills that people obtain through education, experience, and training. Imagine Fred's hand tools were replaced with new power tools. All of a sudden, Fred would be able to produce more output in the same amount of time. His increase in productivity would be due to investment in physical capital. And then, when Fred learns to use the new power tools more effectively, he'll likely increase his productivity even more. This increase in productivity would be due to investment in human capital. Increasing the productivity of workers allows for more production without an increase in resources. And improvements in productivity will shift the frontier outward, which illustrates our fourth lesson. Lesson 4, an outward shift of the frontier reflects economic growth. Fred increased his productivity by learning how to use new tools. Increasing the productivity of workers allows for more production without an increase in resources. And improvements in productivity will shift the frontier outward, which reflects economic growth. For Econ Isle, an outward shift can mean that it can produce both more gadgets and more widgets. Notice that I said the economy can produce more of both goods. Remember that when the PPF is static, producing more gadgets means producing fewer widgets. There is an opportunity cost. But when the frontier shifts outward, it is possible to produce more of both goods. Economists call this economic growth, a sustained rise over time in a nation's production of goods and services. Economic growth is important because it allows more people to have more of what they want over time. Be sure to watch part 3 of this series to learn our final lesson, and we'll wrap up this episode.
So as you can see, there's a lot that goes into the production possibilities curve, and it is a direct reflection of the economy. Now, granted, Econ Island has widgets and gadgets, but the point being is that it's still an economy as a whole. So now we start to take that beyond just one. We start to look at how we can compare different opportunity costs and different economies. For instance, here's England and France. England and France both can produce wine and cloth. And given their particular availability of resources, they have 2 different production possibilities curve. Which one has an opportunity cost of cloth that's lower? The answer is England. Because when England chooses to produce more cloth, its cost in wine is fairly low. Look at how flat that curve is, rise over run. When France decides to produce a little more a little more cloth, look at how much wine it has to give up. So if you look at the difference between 100 and 200, you can see that we went from maybe about 400 wines to 200. That's 200 wine. Whereas, for instance, when England goes from 100 to 200, it's less than 100 in wine. So its opportunity cost is far lower. So additional resources are definitively needed to improve your economic situation. Resources or improvement in technology will move your entire production possibilities curve outward. You can produce more wheat and more computers, or any combination in between. In this particular case, the production possibility curve moved out, and everyone will be better off because there are additional resources or improvement in technology, which we just learned about with Econ Isle. Now, it's not always true that everything works equally. For instance, in this particular example, you have the production of computers and the production of cars. We have a nice blue production possibilities curve, and you can all draw it, where the base here for cars is 1,000, and if you were to produce only computers, you'd be at 3,000. Now what happens? There's a technological advance in the computer industry, which enables the economy to produce more computers for any given car. In other words, it's a one-sided technology advance. So all of a sudden, if they didn't produce any cars, they could produce 4,000 computers. But if they produce only cars, they're still at 1,000. So the curve is still going to fall down to the 1,000, but it's going to go all the way up to 4. So what are we doing? We've moved the production possibility curve outward, but only for one particular case. So if you were to look at point A, and you guys can draw this one, and that means that we are producing 600 cars and we're producing 2,200 computers. And then all of a sudden, you go to 650 cars. What happens with the computers? You went to 23,000 computers. The production of both cars and computers increases at some points because we've gotten so much more efficient with computers. But as we get to the point in which we only produce cars, obviously the efficiency goes away. So it allows you to be better off. Even if it's a one-sided improvement, everybody's better off, but it's just weighted to one side or the other. So why is this bowed outward? What is it about the production possibilities curve that when I started to look at the ones that were more traditional, I have now a curve that has a little bit of a bow versus that nice linear line? Well, what really ends up happening is that the opportunity costs increase as you move from one to another. So if we start off with beer and we're moving towards mountain bikes, when you're in the middle, it seems as though the curve is kind of nice and relative. But when you start to get towards only producing mountain bikes, you see that you start losing more and more beer. And this is partially because the opportunity cost starts to increase as you produce and get closer to only producing one item. So if we look at this at point A, most of the workers are producing beer. And even those are probably better suited to building bikes. Why is that? See, at point A, this is mostly a beer economy, which means that there are probably people in the labor force who are so much better mechanically at doing something like a bicycle than they are at producing beer. So what ends up happening right there is that you've got an opportunity cost on mountain bikes is relatively low. You don't have to give up much beer to get more mountain bikes. Because what's happening is that you're moving your resources at that point in time from A to probably whatever that, let's call it B. You're moving the resources over, and the resources you're probably moving are those people who are so good at bikes and probably really not very, very good brewers. So you start to get that kind of trade-off. As you move all the way to this new B, you've got a lot more workers that are producing bikes and a few left producing beer. Now you got the best brewers. So now as you start to shift towards more and more bikes, now you've got your best brewers moving away from beer production, and you're starting to cause a drop in beer. So either side of the production possibility curve, when you're more at these ends, you're giving up a lot of one for another lot of another for one. For instance, when you got too high into beer, if you went from the point that's not labeled to A, you didn't give up too much beer, but you gave a lot of mountain bikes. When you're down here at the closer to the mountain bikes, as you move towards more and more mountain bikes, you give up a ton of beer. So as you get to those steep ends, you're causing people who are probably much more suited to one to move to another. And if we think about yourself and your majors and what you're thinking about doing in life, you realize that everybody is suited to things differently. And although you could probably do something else, for instance, I probably could put together a mountain bike, I'm probably much better off brewing beer because I like chemistry, because I like to cook. I'm probably much better at it. So the economic reason behind the bowing outward is because different workers have different skills. And there's different opportunity costs. And so some resources or a mix of resources will cause varying opportunity costs. And one of the examples frequently used is land use. Some land is well suited to farming. Some land does not have a ton of rocks. Some land is relatively flat. It makes sense. Some land is not suited to farming. If all land in the United States was dedicated to farming, we wouldn't necessarily produce that much more Then we produce when the optimal land for the United States is used for farming. And this is where you have to allocate your resources according to what really makes sense. This gets us at the end of chapter 2. We've gone through and we've discussed what? We've discussed that there's macro and micro issues. We've discussed that economists are policy advisors and they make different types of statements, normative and positive. We've discussed economists as scientists in terms of 2 different models, the circular flow diagram and the production possibilities frontier. And these will come back and we will discuss these over and over again. But these are kind of the concepts that start to have the foundation of where we are moving to macro issues for the rest of the semester. Thank you, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.